So now we come to the work you did in trying to get those schools opened again and what you've found. So they're opened again. There has been in this country, and I no doubt in your country and every country which locked down children, an impact on the mental health of children. I don't know whether that has been documented in your country, but presumably that has. I mean, children's mental health is, there's lots of reasons for ill mental health in children and adolescents, but the lockdown had an impact here. I don't know whether that was the same with you.
I mean, we had some reports by organizations as UNICEF, also a consortium of universities did a study on mental health. But I have, the perception that we need more to go and develop a research agenda to assess these impacts. I think, what happened is that in a way we quickly kind of like, in Spanish we say pasar la página, which is like we move the page. Okay, now we move the page, let's continue, And also, I mean, I can understand also why that might be a healthy thing to do at some point, but I think we need to go back and assess the implications of decisions that were made on the name of COVID, because they have created a legacy in policy making, and that is what is happening with the school closures now in Peru.
As an anthropologist, I suppose, school is not just about Zoom. It's about education, is about sport, it's about interacting, it's about social interaction, learning how to interact with your peers and develop relationships. As an anthropologist, that's in our DNA, I suppose. And is that one of the things that struck you, that children were being locked away from other human beings, and that is not good for mental health, it's not good for development? Is that something that you were concerned about?
Yeah, I was really concerned by the fact that everything reopened before the services that were linked to children and adolescents. So I think that's a very clear indicator of priorities, as a country, as a society, as a policy-making space. And there was a clear contradiction. Many of these policies, as for example, the long school closures, were justified in terms of the children's well-being. But if you critically assess the implications, you see that well-being was not the main thing behind those decisions. There was, of course, fear in decision makers, and I can understand why. You had this big responsibility. Also, school teachers' unions were not very active in terms of pushing school reopenings. The academic sector did not raise this agenda as part of their priorities back in COVID years. So I think there was a mixture of factors.
But is it possible to argue, there has been arguments here where people say, well, children are resilient. They are so resilient, aren't they brilliant? We had politicians saying that they bounce back, they'll come through it. That was the argument here. Are you saying that not all children will bounce back from 2 years of lockdown, that they don't just bounce back? How do you quantify those lost years, if you call them lost years? Do they bounce back?
Well, I mean, there's been studies by the World Bank, for example, that they have measured, the level of learning loss in many countries across the world, and for sure there would be, further studies coming in the future. But what I think, I connect, I can relate with what you said, because I remember when I began to advocate for school reopening, some people will tell me, okay, no, but Norma, come on, they will recover, they will learn eventually. And I think that was totally misguided. I mean, we were not talking about the fact that if they learn to read or not. I mean, a very important skill in life, but we're talking about the fact that you locked them for 2 years without face-to-face education. And that was an enormous burden for families, an enormous burden for children. And of course, yes, I mean, not all the children reacted the same, but I think that in terms of the lessons learned, governments need to understand that it is not fair to put the burden on the sector of society that does not vote, that cannot speak from themselves. It was easy, having adults saying that, oh no, they will cope. But why on earth would you put all the burden on them instead of, having a feasible solution with an intergenerational justice perspective? Because as an anthropologist, I would thought, how you frame public problems and why, in not only Peru, but I think it was sort of like a global problem. Why didn't we frame having children, with lockdowns and with the school closed as a problem? Why did we thought that they were going to cope as easily as in other situations? I mean, there was no evidence to back up on that. And it was a wishful thinking, wishful thinking to, in a way, make things better for probably the ones that were making decisions. But when you look at reality, there was a complex situation that was created, and there are stories to be told, data to be analyzed to assess this, because this cannot happen again. And part of the reason why we're talking now is that those COVID policy legacies are still harming Peruvian education, because
Yes.
our government is still using remote learning as a solution to other problems, non-health related, by the way.
So this is what I was going to ask you about next. This has become now a viable policy. What was never seen before is now used by the government for non-health issues. So schools are closed and closed for all sorts of reasons now. And just talk us through this, and when is it happening, and what is the justification?
Yeah. Okay. So before the pandemic, of course, we had, for example, teachers protests, and we had governance situations, and there were, occasions in which schools were closed. And when that happened before the pandemic, those days were recovered. You had changes in the calendar, and classes were given, to the children. When COVID came, remote learning became a viable option in terms of the policy making thinking. I'm phrasing that because in theory you have remote learning, but in practice you have a mixed implementation landscape where you have children that do not have connectivity, do not have the means to follow education through remote means, and the ones that do have the means, and have the computers and have the Zoom, there's a question about is that the education we want to provide? Is this what we want the schools to become? A sort of teleconference when you see the children and they listen to the teacher through the screens? Of course not. At least that's my humble opinion. Not to say that you can have all the innovations you want in technology and education, but this emergency remote learning clearly is not part of the things we would like to promote. But okay, when children came back in March 2022, they had to wear compulsory masking until November 2020, around that time. With this
November 2022.
2022, yes,
Yeah.
yes. So
yeah.
basically most of that academic year with mask. And as you may imagine, it was very complicated for children, for teachers, and for the whole socialization process. Apart from that, when schools reopened, we had these strict, regulations in terms of space, and I mean, it was very complicated for schools to adapt, to these requests that were being made by the health authority. But by November 2022, children were allowed to leave mask, and they were able to breathe again. So, if you think of it, the first normal educational year for Peruvian children was 2023.
And I just really want to grasp onto this, how it affected them. If their speech and language is being impaired by masks, if their world is being closed down behind a Zoom and not able to socialize, surely that's impacted behavior, socialization, just development generally. But maybe that's not for this podcast, really. You're talking about the policies and how they were unfairly hitting on children. Perhaps that's not for now, but I wondered if you had any comments.
Well, yeah, no, I think there will be essential to address, the wider implications of specific policies such as compulsory masking in children. I remember, after, schools were allowed to reopen, a couple of months after that, with this group of, Volvamos a Clases Peru, we began a second campaign to take masks out of classes. And that was a difficult one, because people will say, but you are not doctors. What are you talking about? Da, 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 and again, through Google, you could see what was happening in other parts of the world, So, and I remember in particular, Dr. Sebastián González from Uruguay. He's also part of, I think, a Collateral Global network. I mean, he was really helpful. We invited him through some events by Zoom, to provide, evidence and to discuss about the implications for children. And, at schools, teachers knew that was, complicated. Imagine having physical education, having children all day with masks, Not only it was complicated in terms of their development and their ability to interact, but also in terms of economic implications for families, families with poor children, they were not able to afford masks every day. Many of them recycled the mask, So that was, wider implications there. But well, finally, in late 2022, the government allowed, children to decide if they wanted to use compulsory masking or not. Some children still continue to do it. Parents, were afraid, but that was a breaking point because you could see the power of choice, and you could see. I remember going through to my daughter's school, and you could see all these happy, smiling faces, And I remember there's a cartoonist here in Peru, Andres Ederi, and he did this wonderful cartoon about, it was teachers and children was like, so happy to see your face again, So that was, the good news at the end of 2022. But if you think of it, it was just in 2023 when we had a normal educational year in Peru, where you had schooling from Monday to Friday, when you did not have masks, and children could be, experience schools again.
Unbelievable. So when they were out on the playing field and exercising, and when they were on the bus, were they in masks or how did it work? I mean,
no, when it was compulsory, you had to wear masks like all day.
All the time. All day.
All day.
I mean, even when you were doing whatever sport, whatever you were doing.
Yeah. It was awful. It was awful, and again, and I remember, me as a university teacher, the university where I work reopened in August 2022. It was one of the few universities that actually opened in 2022. Still, we were coming back to university a semester after the children. The children were already in class since March 2022. And I remember teaching a class with a mask. I mean, it was awful. I mean, I couldn't bear it, And I mean, again, I know this is very personal. Some people, were afraid, but if you look at what was happening outside educational institutions, people were not wearing masks. I mean, how ridiculous it was. I would do all my life without masks, but when I came to my class, I had to wear a mask in order to teach. I could take it out when I left the classroom, but when I was teaching, I had to wear it. As ridiculous as it sounds. And, back in 2022, for example, children would have to wear a mask since they got into school until they left.
Outside the school, you could do whatever you want. You had a birthday party, no mask, fine. You see? So that's where what I, it's a, and when you think of it, there's a fertile ground for historians here. What was going on? How could we sustain policies that did not have any, connection with what's happening in reality?
No, that's exactly it.